What's going on, everybody? This is the Total Takedown. My name is Clint. I am your host from the Die Hard MMA podcast. This show is presented to you by Pub Sports Radio, and the lines are powered by Superbook Sports. What we do on this show is go back over the card, and we're only talking totals. How long these fights are going to last, overs, unders. If you want to see the full breakdown of the fights, predictions, stylistic matchups, that takes place on Monday. That's right here in Pub Sports Radio on the YouTube channel. Let's go ahead and talk some totals. First fight of the night, UFC Vegas 51. We are kicking the evening off with Alatang Hailey taking on Kevin Croom. This fight takes place at 135. Big question mark for me here on this fight is what Kevin Croom is going to look like when he drops down to 135 pounds. He's getting older, and whenever fighters get older and cut weight, it terrifies me because sometimes their bodies just don't react well. Now, if he can do the cut well, if he can do the cut safely, he's going to have a massive size advantage over Alatang Hailey. Now, Hailey is a really tough guy to finish. Very durable. We saw that in the Casey Kenny fight. He's got some solid power of his own, and he's got some decent wrestling when he chooses to go to it. Kevin Croom is a guy that we saw just crank up the volume on his striking his last fight out. He engages in the grappling pretty readily, and he's got a good solid submission upside. So I actually think there is some finishing upside for both fighters in this spot. Total set at 2.5. The over 2.5 is minus 165. The under 2.5 is plus 145. And I do think this is a spot where we might be able to bet on violence. It's not a fight that I'm super sold on. It's not one that I'm really excited to get invested and get my money in on. But I do definitely think that there is some upside for the violence here. Kevin Croom, by way of submission, having that gigantic size advantage. Hailey Alatang being able to TKO somebody who's potentially going to be weakened from an extra hard cut, something he hasn't really done in years. And I think both guys can probably find their way to a finish, but let's make sure we check out Kevin Croom on the scales tomorrow for the Friday Undefeated Post Weigh-In show before we make any moves on this fight. Next up, Sam Hughes taking on Estela Nunez, women's MMA, total set at 2.5, the over 2.5 minus 260, the under 2.5 plus 230, and I do have to kind of side with the chalk here, looking on the over. Sam Hughes is primarily a grappler. She likes to get in your face, plod forward, put the pace on you. And then if she can get you to the ground, she does have a couple of submission victories. However, those are all pre-UFC, so not something we've seen her do at this level. She has switched camps coming into this fight. I do expect improvements from Sam Hughes, but Estela Nunez is a really solid prospect. She's training out of ATT. She's got a good camp around her. She's not someone who's super easy to finish, although the losses on her record are by way of submission. She's got some big hands on her, though. She likes to strike. She hits hard. So I think there is maybe a little bit of finishing upside on this one, but I also think with Sam Hughes back up against the wall, I think this is going to be a just win spot where we see her not doing anything crazy, not going for anything low percentage. She is going to try to grind her way to a win, and if anything, she probably wins a decision, and I think she's tough enough to just hang in there with someone like Estela Nunez. Remember, we're in the small cage. We're back in the UFC Apex, and I do think that favors Sam Hughes somewhat, being able to crowd Nunez, get inside that range advantage that she's going to have, get inside those kicks so she won't be able to use that main long reach and offense. So I think we're getting for a grind. I think this one's going over. Minus 260, a bit steep, but hey, that's women's MMA for you. Next up, Trey Ogden taking on Jordan Leavitt. Total set at 2.5 for this one. Over 2.5, minus 105. Under 2.5, minus 115. And I do think that there is a decent chance of this one finishing inside the distance as well. Trey Ogden's a BJJ black belt. I believe Jordan Leavitt's a BJJ brown belt, although he seems a little bit craftier, a little trickier on the mat from what we've seen so far in his cage time. He's one of those guys that just needs one takedown. If he gets you on the ground once, he can just tie you up into a pretzel and find a way to tap you out. Trey Ogden's a guy that's been submitted a couple of times, so that's totally live here, but he's a better wrestler. So he could potentially submit Jordan Leavitt if this fight goes long, or, he's probably the better striker as well. So if he's able to keep this thing standing, not get engaged in those grappling scrambles, Trey Ogden might be able to TKO a tired Jordan Leavitt down the line. Under 2.5, minus 115 doesn't sound so bad to me. Next fight up, heavyweights. Chris Barnett taking on Martin Buday. Total set at 1.5 for this bad boy. Over 1.5 is plus 105. Under 1.5 is minus 125. And I'm actually looking at potentially placing a bet on this one. I like this over 1.5. We've seen it in heavyweight matchups a lot, that we expect these fights to be one round because of the size, because of the power, how much muscle these guys have throwing around. But we just don't. One thing we see over and over and over again is these fights, especially when they're competitively matched, they actually take longer than we expect. And Chris Barnett's a guy that's actually really tough and really durable. Martin Buday coming off a big finish on the Dana White Contender Series. Everyone's high on this kid right now, but Chris Barnett is technically a step up in competition. When you get that first step up, you don't always get the finish as easily as people tend to think that you would. So while I think he beats Barnett, I don't know that he does it in the first round. I don't know that he just steamrolls through a guy like Chris Barnett that's got a ton of experience. And Barnett is on record saying that his whole strategy for this fight is the Homer Simpson approach. He's going to try and take everything Buday has got in that first round, come out and be the better conditioned, more, deeper gas tank fighter, and then take over in rounds 2 and 3. So as long as Barnett's able to implement his game plan, he's just looking to survive round 1. I think he can. So I think that over 1.5, especially getting a plus number on it, I don't mind that at all, and I'm actually probably going to be taking some action on that one. Next up, we got Rafa Garcia taking on Jesse Ronson, and it looks like for some reason that one is not up on Superbook, so I'm going to use a different book just for a quote here, so we've got a line for reference. Total set at 2.5, and looks like the over 2.5 is minus 185. The under 2.5 is plus 150. Now, I am on Ronson big in this spot, and I think I'm well documented saying that I actually think that he finishes Rafa Garcia. Now, Rafa Garcia is a guy that's never been finished before, so a lot of people think that might be a tall order. But Jesse Ronson was up at 170 in his last fight and absolutely steamrolled Dalby, a guy who's very known for his durability. I think he knows the assignment here. He's talked about wanting to get Rafa Garcia tired, which we see in every single Rafa Garcia fight, is that he gasses out and slows down. If he's able to do that, being the bigger man down at 155, I definitely think there's some finishing upside for Jesse Ronson. And then if, now I don't really buy into this myself, but if Jesse Ronson is coming off of the gear, if he is going to be less of a fighter this time around because of that USADA suspension, then Rafa Garcia potentially can put a pace on him, grind him out with that wrestling, and TKO him late. So I do think there's a chance that this fight finishes inside the distance. I definitely lean more towards the Ronson side than the Rafa Garcia side, but I'd be looking under before I looked over on that particular fight. Next up, we got Drakkar Klose taking on Brandon Jenkins. Total set at 2.5. Over 2.5 minus 105, under 2.5 minus 115, and this does feel like a violent spot to me. I mean, Drakkar Klose is a ridiculous -7, -800 favorite. They expect him to just walk through Brandon Jenkins. And if he goes for the takedowns, if he engages the grappling, I do think there's some chance that he finishes Brandon Jenkins. Maybe with some ground and pound or submission, something like that. But the thing I've been harping on all week is that Drakkar Klose is on record saying that he still hasn't recovered from the Jeremy Stephens push. I think Drakkar Klose's chin is compromised, guys. I've been saying this for a long time, ever since that knockout to Beneil Dariush. That's a life-changing KO. Some people literally never recover from those kinds of knockouts, and we haven't seen him in action yet, so we don't know if he is going to be the same guy in there or not. He's a dude that's been relatively durable, able to go 1-for-1 with his opponents and tank the damage and come back and get the win. I just don't know if that's going to be the game plan anymore. And if he is dealing with those types of symptoms, then there's a chance he doesn't really want to engage on the feet at all. He might be a little gun shy in this fight. So I do think there's some violence opportunity here because Brandon Jenkins, they call him the human highlight reel. This guy throws spinning kicks, flying knees, like he does everything he can to just touch your chin once. And apparently he went out to the UFC PI for this fight and put out 9 pounds of solid muscle. Another guy I'm looking very closely at on the Friday Undefeated post-weigh-in show, because if he's put on 9 pounds of muscle, that's going to make his weight cut that much more difficult. So that'll help an under as well. If he really struggles getting to the scales, that's something that we might look to exploit. On the other hand, if he put on 9 pounds of muscle and he looks fantastic, might be worth a degenerate sprinkle. We'll see what happens. There's going to be some interesting fights to look at on tomorrow's show. But for this show, I'm going to be looking at that under 2.5. Not one that I don't think I'm actually betting at this point, but if you're going to play the total, again, I'm thinking violence is probably the way to go. Next fight up is going to be Lena Landsberg taking on Piani Kinzad. Total at 2.5. Over is -350. Under is +290. And I talked about it on the Monday show, man. Lena Landsberg, she always ends up in these close, grinding, gritty decisions. And I kind of expect the same thing here. So I'm going to say over. Let's save a little bit of time on that one. If there's going to be a finish, it's probably from Kinzad because Landsberg just doesn't have it anymore. Devin Clark taking on Will Knight up next. Total set again at 2.5. Over is -155. Under is +135. And again, I've got a sinking suspicion here on violence, but I like to have both fighters contributing to my totals whenever I play a violence spot. And I think Devin Clark not liking to get punched in the face, which is something we've seen time and time again. Dude's a little suspect. Dude's a little chinny. Really relies on his grappling. He's taking this fight up at heavyweight against Will Knight, and I want to see how heavy Will Knight comes in, because if he's got a 20-pound weight advantage in this spot because he just doesn't have to cut, then he's going to have a lot of extra explosiveness, a lot of extra strength, something that Devin Clark isn't used to dealing with. And we've seen that when Will Knight explodes, he does have some knockout power in his hands. So I would be tempted on the under here because Will Knight can clip, and Devin Clark is a guy that just doesn't like to get punched very much. But it's pretty binary, because if this fight goes over, that means it's Devin Clark probably using his classic grinding wrestling offense and just chipping his way to a decision. So as much as I hate to say it, it's kind of Will Knight under, Devin Clark over. Maybe Will Knight can get an over here, but it's kind of hard to believe since we know the game plan Devin Clark comes with. I think Will Knight is going to be defending takedowns more than going for them offensively. But again, that strength advantage with this thing being up at heavyweight, he might be able to out-bully the bully. I'm really not sure. It's a sketchy fight. Please be careful if you're betting on that particular fight. Ange Lusa taking on Mounir Lazzez, it looks like, coming up next here. And total is set at 2.5. Over 2.5 -175. Under 2.5 is +155. And I hate to say it, but I think I kind of like over here. Mounir Lazzez is a guy that's really a flowing striker. We saw what he did with Abdulrazak Alhassan. He avoids the power shots. He skips around the cage, uses his footwork and his movement real well. But that definitely lends itself to an over. Ange Lusa is a guy who's got some crazy knockout power. He's explosive, and if he clips you, he's going to put you down. That would definitely contribute to our under. And we saw Lazzez get overwhelmed in round 1 in his last fight. However, Lusa being the one coming in on short notice, we've seen him kind of be susceptible to that stick and move jab game plan. I'm kind of siding with Lazzez here, and I think this one's going over. Next up, we got Pat Sabatini taking on TJ Laramie. Total set at 2.5. Over 2.5 -120. Under 2.5 +100. I think it's going over, folks. TJ Laramie is going to control this thing with his wrestling. He's got good hips, good sprawl, good takedown defense. And I do think he's the better wrestler than Pat Sabatini. Even though he's the smaller man, I just think Pat's going to have a hard time getting underneath those hips. So if TJ decides where this fight takes place, it probably remains standing, or he'll be in wrestling control positions. I don't see TJ TKOing or submitting Pat Sabatini. So if it takes place standing on the feet, I don't think either guy's got the TKO type of power to finish each other. I think over 2.5 is a decent look in that spot. Mayra Bueno Silva taking on Wu Yanan. Total set at 2.5. And again, this one's sketchy as all hell. Mayra Bueno can finish Wu Yanan if she decides to grapple. End of story. She doesn't shoot takedowns, though. So if she doesn't shoot takedowns, she's going to have to rely on Wu doing the takedowns. I don't see that happening. I kind of think we're in for a 15-minute striking match. Over 2.5, -160. Kind of sounds terrifying considering Mayra Bueno can take her down and probably tap her in the first round if she really wanted to. But I'd be looking over. Probably not one I'm planning on playing. Next up, André Fialho taking on Miguel Baeza. This fight is super interesting to me. Total set at 1.5. Over 1.5 -175. Under 1.5 +155. I think there is some violence upside here. I mean, André Fialho is a guy that's been finished a couple times. He's been generally durable, but we see him tire out and gas out. He's a young fighter. He's making improvements. Maybe he'll patch that up. Miguel Baeza, big time power, BJJ black belt, but we've also seen him have some chin concerns. He's been clipped. He's been rocked. He was knocked out in his last fight. I definitely think there's some side here, but if you're on the Miguel Baeza side, like I said, he's coming off a bad knockout loss. He might look to use his grappling. He might look to stick and move and try and work his way to a 15-minute decision, low variance, avoid the big power shot. And that definitely would, he could look like a minus 500 and this thing could sail to the judges' scorecards super easily if that's the game plan coming from him. So another very interesting and sketchy fight. I don't know that I'm betting that one. Co-main event, Borralho taking on Gadzhi Argomenizov. I butchered that one. I got to talk to John Anik on how to pronounce that kid's name. This one's set at 2.5, over 2.5 minus 110, under 2.5 minus 110, straight pick'ems. I'm going to lean over here. And again, it does seem almost a little bit binary. A lot of people think Ciaro wins this thing, and he does it by flashy knockout. I think Gadzhi is going to be able to get his wrestling game plan on. Small cage. We know that favors the grapplers. So I'm fully expecting this thing to go over and hit the judges' scorecards. Ciaro can actually also win a judge's decision in this type of spot as well. Don't think he's KO or bust. He did it on the Dana White Contender Series. He can work his way to a 15-minute decision as well. So I think the over 2.5 has some decent value there. Main event time, Vicente Luque, Belal Muhammad. This total set at 4.5. And over 4.5 plus 110, under 4.5 minus 130. Under is Luque, over is Belal. We got a lot of these fights on this card here. If Belal's going to win this fight, he's not tapping Luque. He's not knocking out Luque. So if Belal wins this fight, it's going to be by decision. And if Luque wins this fight, he could win it by decision. He could win minutes on the feet. But more than likely, if Luque is doing what he does, he probably clips Belal and puts him down at some point. So you just kind of got to pick your fighter in this spot. I lean more towards Luque eventually finding the chin of Belal. Belal maybe having some early success with the grappling, rounds 1 and 2, and then slowing and Vicente Luque eventually starting to touch him up, putting him down, maybe the 3rd round or the 4th round. That's kind of how I see this fight playing out. I would be looking violence. I would be looking under, but I also would not be shocked if Belal was able to come out here and just maul his way to a 25-minute decision. He's been looking better than we've seen him ever before, and I don't really want to step in front of that train right now, so not a total that I'm very interested in backing, but if I had to pick one, which I do for the show, I'd be looking under. Make sure you subscribe here to Pub Sports Radio, folks. That is the total takedown. See you tomorrow for the undefeated post-weigh-in show. We've been on a bit of roll. We got right with last week's show, so let's stay hot. Let's hit some of these spots here and hopefully make some money. Let's roll.